Everybody, welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. And we have a great friend of the show back today, Matthew Ho, coming to us live from North Carolina, I believe, right? That's where you're at. You're in your studios there in North Carolina.
Yeah, this little small room.
That's nice, man. Yeah, it looks great, though.
House,
I've always meant to tell you that's a really cool look there. I've always liked it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I had some help picking out the colors and such. So yeah.
Don't we all? We all know.
Exactly. Yeah. That's one of my favorite things, right? Is how I like to convince myself that I'm smart, because the definition of a smart person is someone who listens to other smart people and then changes their mind. And yeah, I know enough to listen to people, right?
Very smart.
Yeah, very smart.
Yeah, especially like that Julian Assange in the back. We're going to be talking about that pretty soon here, I believe, on one of our upcoming shows. I'm looking forward to that. That's going to be an interesting thing to discuss.
Definitely.
Doesn't get enough publicity, I think.
Yeah, and his extradition can really come at any time, and most likely it'll be kind of middle of the night, absconded away to the United States and put in prison and set up for trial in the Eastern District of Virginia, which is the secret courts that the federal government uses to prosecute all national security cases. And he'll get the same amount of fairness in his trial that, we would expect from something like this, which is about zero. It'll be a secret trial, right? We can't tell you what the evidence is because it's secret, that type of thing.
Yeah. There's not many people who even know much about that anymore, which is why we're going to devote this whole show to it. But there's lots of things that even people who know something about it, there's a lot they don't know. And I'm looking forward to getting into that. But what we're going to talk about today, though, is something a little more personal, something that affects actually both you and me to various degrees, and hundreds of thousands of our colleagues who have also fought in wars, and now hundreds of thousands more in other wars across the seas there. And that is PTSD and traumatic brain injury. Now, a lot of people have heard those terms, but we're going to make it a little bit more personal today, and we're going to share with you some of the things that have afflicted Matt here. He's been willing to open up about some things that have affected him. And the focus of this is right now, anyway, is on the war in Ukraine. So last night, the Senate passed their version of a spending bill to get us through this continuing resolution to kick the can down the road another period of time now to, I think, late January, early February. And an interesting thing about this is there was a lot of debate about providing money for Israel and money for the Ukraine war. Now, these two CRs, or the CR that was passed by both the Senate and the House, do not include any money on that. But that's a big contention. A lot of people are going to be talking about they want a separate bill, a clean bill standalone for funding that the president wants, that most in Congress say that they want. But, it's funny. You don't hear much about the people that this money is going to help. You don't hear much about the soldiers. You hear a lot about tanks and F-16s and artillery round, long-range rockets. You hear about all those kinds of weapons of war, but you don't hear anything about the men that are going to use them. And we're going to talk about that today. What the impact of now 21 months of uninterrupted war at the highest level since World War II that anybody in the world has seen. And we're going to talk about the human dimension of this, because that gets lost way too many times. And let me set the stage a little bit for you. First of all, here's one report from CBS.
I'm rather tired to kill another people.
Andriy is on a week's break from defending the besieged town of Bakhmut. A former businessman, this father of two has faced waves of Russian Wagner mercenaries.
We can kill 10, 20, 50 of them, but they shall try to attack our positions.
The Ukrainian conflict has largely been an artillery war. But increasingly in the east, it's being fought at extremely close quarters.
Actually, it's very difficult to kill people in direct combat. When you are involved in a direct combat, you understood, you see, you feel everything.
You see who you've killed?
Yes.
That is such a poignant reminder there. And that's just one kid, but there are hundreds of thousands like him. But Matt, as you and I talked about on the phone earlier this morning, it's not limited just to the combatants.
Correct. It's this idea that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is contagious is an accurate one. I mean, it's that's a glib way of saying that secondary PTSD exists, and that those who come home from war scarred by it mentally, emotionally, spiritually, the way they present themselves, the way they conduct themselves, the way that they end up living their lives has a very real and profound effect. It ripples out from them like a pebble, right, that you throw into a puddle, and just washes over and affects everyone in their lives. But of course,
To that point here, we actually have one more clip that I want to show that addresses exactly that issue, and I want your view on the other side of this.
Когда вели бои в Белогоровке, попал сюда со спиной из-за веса и контузило. По нам танчик отработал и возле блиндажа плотно прилетело. И сюда с контузией попал. Когда уже понял, что начинает пропадать память, забывать, и начал забываться и речь. Меня когда привезли, только с боев, как меня вывезли, у меня был сильный тремор рук, то есть и все тело так трусилось. Заикаться сильно заикался.
Не, по поводу нервы і по сьогоднішню минуту, конечно, переживаю я за свою дитину, за його состояние, это очень тяжело. Ну і мама сама в Куп'янське пережила і окупацію, і деокупацію. Поэтому я, як ніхто, понимаю, що це таке вот эта лінія фронту, і як вот это під градами міномет.
So it's not just something that the men, but as you talked about, it affects people coming home. Now, before we get into too much of your experiences, can you kind of bring us up to date a little bit on what your combat experience was? I think you had two separate tours in Iraq. And first of all, I just want you to tell us a little bit about what you did and what you experienced during those two conflicts.
Sure. The first time I was in Iraq, I was a U.S. Department of Defense official. There's a long story behind that, but I had gotten off active duty and gone to work for the Department of Defense and went to Iraq to be a part of, in the final days of what was the Coalition Provisional Authority that then became the U.S. Embassy in Iraq in 2004. And I was I was north of Baghdad, based in Tikrit, working in 4 different provinces up there. And I was basically a civilian administrator. I was responsible for doing political and reconstruction work. And so, saw a lot of things shot at me, shot near me, blown up near me, that kind of thing. For that experience, though, the impact was the close presence I had to the Iraqis and the direct effects on them, the relationships I had, and then seeing how the war literally, in some cases, literally tore them apart. They were killed. In other ways, that they suffered and their families and the people suffered. The second time I went back as a reservist with the Marine Corps, had a command of a combat engineer company in Anbar province, the second most violent province after Baghdad, of course. And, saw direct combat.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but that was during the Anbar Awakening. Is that right?
I was there got there and we got there early fall 2006. And so while we were there, it was the state of things was such that you couldn't leave your fire base, your FOB, your COP, what battle position, whatever you want to call them. We call them all those different things without something happening, right? We call them ticks, right? Troops in contact. I mean, that happened just continuously. Every time you rolled out, there's a good chance, better than average, that you were going to get into a firefight. Someone's going to shoot an RPG at you. IED was going to go off. You're going to find an IED. My Marines actually did route clearance, which meant they went out driving around looking for roadside bombs. Right. So a lot of that experience, a lot of that type of leading troops in combat, so I had both those experiences of being on the civilian side and on the military side. One heavily engaged with the civilian population, seeing the effects on them, and then on the other as well,
Hey, so let me ask you, what was, if you can tell us from your Anbar province period of time, give us just like one vignette of one of the most harrowing firefights or engagements that you may have had that has really left a memory a mark on your memory?
There's one the one I guess that always comes to mind. It wasn't so harrowing. It wasn't uh, uh, pleasant. But and certainly we were in danger, and we were having automatic rifle fire fired at us and RPGs, and we were kind of trapped in a position. This is in Haditha. We were kind of trapped in a position where there was no good place to go, and then the only thing we could do was advance forward towards where the insurgents were. And so then you had to, your thoughts in your head, now I got to go in this building and fight these guys, and not really anything you want to do in the moment. I know there's some guys out there that might have liked that kind of thing, but I think most of us prefer not to do that kind of stuff. But the thing about it, though, at that point made it so harrowing were these two little Iraqi girls who were nearby, who were there, who just kind of stumbled onto the scene as it was happening, or kind of got caught in the crossfire, so to speak. And I remember one of them had a Hello Kitty backpack on. And I think about those girls a lot. I think about the Iraqi civilians a lot. And you wonder whatever happened to those girls. This was 2006. So they had to go through, with the Anbar awakening, things settled down very quickly. It became very placid there, very peaceful for about 4 years, until 2011, when you had the resurgence of the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And then, of course, when you had, certainly when Mosul's taken in 2014, by that point, that part of Iraq, Western Iraq, had already been taken by ISIS. So all
that 2006 period there, that may have been the pinnacle of the violence.
It was. I mean, it was. It was very violent. But what goes to show, though, the lesson from that, if you will, was that all we had to do to bring the violence down, to practically end it, was to talk with the resistance, was to talk with the insurgency. Once we spoke with the Sunni nationalists, who composed 97% of the Sunni insurgency. So once we spoke to the actual Sunni people who lived there, who we were occupying, and said, what are your grievances? And they said, well, you've usurped us. We're not in control of our cities, our towns, our villages. We're cut out of the government. You've put these Shia and Kurdish occupation forces here, along with you foreigners. Give us our land and our people back. Once we said, okay, they literally just said, all right, the Al-Qaeda and Iraq guys are over there. They're in that house.
Right.
That's how it happened. And then,
because interesting, the Al-Qaeda and Iraq guys were also attacking the Sunnis themselves. So it's like, we had some common cause to go with you if we had only stopped to listen, because we viewed them all the same, but they definitely weren't.
Right. And it really was this idea that people are going to resist occupation. And if you give them no other outlet, if they have no other choice, they're going to find whatever support they can get. And the only support that the Sunnis could get really came from the Saudis, I guess maybe to a degree from the Syrians, but not really. But so what was that help looking like in 2003, 2004, 2005? That looked like Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That's what they had. And so, and they didn't like them at all. They hated them. Right. And they were butchers. They were, I mean, in Haditha, just because I was there a lot, this is where, local police, Iraqi police, who had kind of stood up to the Al-Qaeda and Iraq guys and said, no, this is our town. They had their heads cut off and put on posts.
It's interesting, Matt. I don't know if you've seen it. We actually did a show earlier this morning on this letter going around, Osama bin Laden's letter to Americans. Got a lot of Americans upset because they basically took it at its face value that, all this stuff Osama bin Laden did and all he said was it was really reasonable, and it explains why so many things happen. But this is actually part of what's not in that letter, and explains some of the complications that are involved here, because these Al-Qaeda and Iraq guys were basically followers of Osama bin Laden who were slaughtering other Muslims because they weren't doing what they wanted. They wanted a nationalist kind of movement, and the Sunnis just wanted their country back, and they wanted us out, and they wanted to be a nationalist. They didn't want to be an internationalist. And so they're fighting against each other, because Osama bin Laden is like, you either do what I say or I'm going to kill you. So even though he had some points that were right, he had a lot of murderous things that he had no tolerance for anybody who disagreed with him. And that's part of the ugly side of this whole situation.
Exactly. And that's an aspect of all this. Resistance, when it turns violent, tends to get more extreme, so that you have the opportunities for people, say like bin Laden, organizations like Al-Qaeda, to not just gain credence, but to have power, to have authority particularly if they're the ones who have the weapons, if they're the ones who have the backing of, say, Saudi Arabia, then of course they're in a good position then to be at the forefront of any resistance, because the general resistance, the general population, don't have that. They're looking for anyone to help them.
Yeah,
And this is why
right.
you don't push people up against the wall. Don't back them into a corner. Don't give them other options.
Yeah,
Address their grievances. And when
Yeah.
we did, and then of course what happens in Iraq, if people remember, is that as we left Iraq in 2011, the Shia government that we have put in power and kept in power,
Right.
turned around and started preying on the Sunni population again. And so
And
then
then-
what happens is the Sunni population says, hey, we need help. We're being oppressed by this government, this Shia government. And who do they turn to? Well, the only people
ISIS,
to turn
there it is.
to was Al-Qaeda in
Yeah.
Iraq, which at that point had turned into the
Turned into
Islamic
ISIS.
State.
Yeah.
And so forth. And then the great horror of that the people of the Euphrates and Tigris River valleys went through under the Islamic State occupation. But then the war that resulted to destroy the Islamic State. I mean, the United States Air Force and Navy destroyed almost every city along the Euphrates and Tigris River valleys from 2013 it begins up through 2018 or so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you were there. You I know
Yeah,
you went to
I was. I saw
Yeah.
a lot of that stuff, but I want to get back and focus on the human aspect of this, because I think too many people, and maybe I'm guilty of it sometimes, we want to talk about the tactics and the strategies and all this kind of stuff that goes along with it, and what we could or should have done in different places and what we should or shouldn't do now. But that's the next episode we'll talk about. But I want to stick on the human element here. So if you could, so you were at the height of the Anbar fighting, and you suffered that stuff, the troops in contact and firefights nearly every day you went out there. Tell us a little bit about what happened when you got back, because as you and I have talked before, there's kind of like two stages and two separate things. There's both the PTSD and the traumatic brain injury. So there's two separate things. A lot of people don't know the difference. And I wonder if you can explain the difference in your own experience.
Right. And I would add a third, which is the moral injury. And these are the three invisible wounds of war that you hear so much about. They've always been around. It's always existed. Our generation is not any different than any other generations of war. This goes back to antiquity. The Romans and the Greeks talk about this. Shakespeare wrote about this. I mean, it's not an American phenomenon either. This occurs to every army, every cadre of veterans in the world. And with the three, with PTSD, TBI, and moral injury, they are different, but they also overlap. So it's often hard to distinguish between them. But then also too, they also are they coexist. They're comorbid in many ways. But PTSD is that response to being in a traumatic situation. It is basically, in the sense of where it is with combat veterans, you're talking about having gone to war, having gone to Iraq, to Afghanistan, say, to keep it in our generation. And every day for 8 months, 12 months, 15 months, going out and hunting other people while other people hunted you. And then you come back and your fight or flight system, your survival system that was meant for us to survive when the saber-toothed tiger walked into our cave, our ancestors' cave, it's been on for 8 months, 12 months, 15 months. It's basically malfunctioned at that point, and it's still producing all that adrenaline and cortisol. And so you're walking around back in a, quote, normal, unquote, circumstance with all these survival chemicals pushing through you. And that causes you to react involuntarily. That's why you have the hyper startle response. You're hyper vigilant. You're having nightmares at night, right? Your body, your brain is trying to process.
No, man, interestingly, when I came back from my second tour in Iraq in I forget 2009, I think it was, we had to go through, I think it was Qatar. We had to fly into Qatar from Baghdad, or from where I think Al Udeid is where I left. We lived somewhere in Qatar, I think it was, and then we did fly back to the U.S. When I landed at the base in Qatar, we got on a bus and had to take a bus drive to the U.S. base there for getting ready for the onward movement to the next phase of it. And I remember being on the bus by the window and looking out at the road and being, I won't say afraid of everything, but like you said, hyper vigilant to, right. Like, I'm like, what is that over there? What is that? it looks like just a wad of paper, but what if there's something inside of it? Because we're trained to be looking for that stuff. And I couldn't turn, I was no longer in the combat zone, but I couldn't turn it off. And I guess that's similar to some of the things you experienced.
It's involuntary. And so same thing. And so I know you want to talk about how it affects others, the people in our lives. So you come home, you go to dinner with your wife or your girlfriend, and you can't look at them because you are, first of all, you got to sit with your back to the wall and everything else. But then you are looking at everybody who's coming into that restaurant. You're checking them out. I mean, and it's involuntary. You can't help it. Your house becomes like a fortress, right? I mean, and you're not even thinking. It's just how it is. And so it's very real. It's neurobiological or neurochemical. They have put Marines and soldiers into imaging machines, looked at their brains before sending them to Iraq or Afghanistan. And then when they come home, they look at their brains again, and their brains have changed in size and shape because of that type of stress, because of those survival chemicals. Again, your limbic system, your survival system always being on. Imagine if it's like the valve has stuck open and, these adrenaline, this cortisol just your body keeps manufacturing it. How do you act then? How do you live back in, again, quote unquote, normal society? But, then with traumatic brain injury, certainly I think people are familiar with that. People are have the understanding of concussions, of brain damage, of brain injury. But what we're talking about here is what used to be, it still is classified as MTBI, or mild traumatic brain injury. And what they have come to realize is that the damage that we sustained in these wars, and certainly there's regular traumatic brain injury, and I'm using very lay terms here. And so guys who had concussions, guys who took rounds or shrapnel to the head, who had that type of traditional type of brain injury. What we're seeing, though, on a massive scale, orders of magnitude that no one expected, no one knew was going to happen because they didn't understand this. I mean, the last numbers I saw from the VA, which are years old, and the VA is doing such a terrible job of updating this because I think they don't want the political pressure, the political repercussions of acknowledging how big this problem is. But the last numbers going back to like 2015 that I saw was the VA estimated that more than 250,000 veterans had traumatic brain injury from their time in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's belied by the fact that they say that the number so that would be less than 10% of the veterans are there. But in their other numbers that they cite, to continue to this day, they cite that up to 20% have TBIs. And the thing is, what happens is that what you have is these blast waves, these shock waves and we understand how that pressure impacts organs, how it impacts your bowels, how it impacts your lungs, your eardrums, things like that. What we didn't understand was how it would affect the brain, and how just you don't need to have a huge, big blast, just small blasts, particularly a number of them, will cause this microscopic scarring. They can't even see the damage that's been done to our brains. So the TBI I have, they can't confirm it until I am dead. They cut my head open and they put my brain under some type of microscopic, neural imaging device so they can see it, because that's how small the tears are. And what that then does, though, is, of course, it manifests years later, and it's very, very debilitating. It is similar.
I want to hone in on that for a second, because you say this stuff takes years to kick in. Now, you and I met in 2009 after you had resigned from the State Department in protest over Obama's policies in Afghanistan. And I was about to go to Afghanistan on what would turn out to be my last combat deployment. So I wanted to meet with you before I went to kind of get the lay of the land and whatever, and turned into now a lifelong friendship. But I remember at the time, that I didn't see or observe any kind of issues with either TBI or with PTSD. But then as the years progressed on, after I got back, because you again were helping me when I came forward with my truth telling in 2011, 2012, and our friendship continued on, and then you started having some real issues in your marriage. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the latency and then what happened and how you dealt with it.
Sure. So with the TBI, it doesn't start to really manifest until 2013, 2014. And the way it manifests for me is debilitating migraines. I mean, just you're not doing anything. I'm not doing anything other than curled up in a ball, and nothing really helps. I mean, I can get into more detail about that, but very limited what I have that works for me when these things kick in. Marijuana is one of the things. And of course, I live in a state where it's illegal, but marijuana is one of those things that works. But with all these medicines, there are side effects, as well as you run into the danger if you use it too much, it loses its potency, it loses its effectiveness. So you have to ration them, right? But anyway, it manifests for me with these debilitating migraines with cognitive dysfunction, brain fog, if you will. But it's more than that, because I have real problem. I can have real problems with doing what's called executive actions, being able to do more than one thing at a time, including like keeping track of 2 open browsers on my computer. Things like that, all of a sudden, I couldn't do. I was having very real problems with. And then extreme fatigue, as if you just came up to me and jabbed me with some type of sedative, like that type of overpowering effect. The other thing that was occurring too, it's important, was the moral injury. So you have the PTSD, the TBI, and then the moral injury, which is the third, which is probably the worst. That's what drives the suicidality. That's what drove the suicidality in me. That's what I believe drives the suicidality in many, many combat veterans, is this shame, this guilt, this regret. So I know the one story we talked about, because back in 2011, I was dealing with this, and I was suicidal. It was very bad. What also comes along are subsets of this secondary problem. So I have this neurocognitive disorder as a secondary issue. I also have substance use issues. I have depression as an issue, as a secondary, because those things result from these 3 problems: TBI, PTSD, and moral injury. But we were just talking about what happened in Iraq, and in 2011, the resurgent Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Islamic State, attacks the provincial council building in Tikrit, kills 60 people, including one of my friends, a man named General Abdullah Jabori. And they execute him, they shoot him in the back of the head. It's awful. And what I went through when I learned of that, and I'd already been going through these things of guilt and shame and regret over the wars, of taking part in it, of what happened to the Iraqi people, what happened to the Afghan people, my role in all that, both direct participation as well as indirect participation, and dealing with that, and the anger I had at myself, at others. Yeah, I remember telling this story. I beat up my refrigerator, which, for anyone who ever does that, anyone who ever punches their refrigerator and puts big dents, you can use a plunger to pull out the dents in the stainless steel. So just as a PSA there, not advocating you do that, but if that's what happens, you find yourself in that situation, go get the plunger and you can pull that dent out. But what that does, though, because when you're living with somebody and no one else knows about this, so as you said, we got to be pretty close. We were, and nobody knew what I was going through. The only people that knew that I was going through were the women that were in my life. And that wrecked relationship after relationship after relationship. And when I started speaking about this publicly about 10 years or so ago, more than that, I guess, there were still World War II vets and Korean vets who would show up at these things. And at the end, they would almost always say things, what, I'm so happy to see this. I'm so happy people see people speaking about this, because back in our day, she was the only one that knew. And so you had these families, and then of course the children know as well, but these families that suffer in silence with their veteran spouse, father, brother, uncle, whoever, who is, trying to survive while dealing with these invisible wounds that affect them, not just mentally, but also emotionally and spiritually. And it ripples out as well. One of the other things I had, something that never gets talked about, and it really should, because there are lots of things that destroy relationships. But when you're a young man and woman, or young man and man, or woman and woman, whatever, but when you're young and you're in this relationship and one of the partners just stops having sex, that completely, what that does to a relationship, what that can do. And so what you see is a loss of libido, a sexual dysfunction, and occurs with all 3 of these, with TBI, with PTSD, with moral injury. And so you have these issues. So where, in my case, the women I'm with, they have to deal with the nightmares and the night terrors I'm going through. They have to deal with my drinking as my way of self-medicating, handling it. They have to deal with like the mood swings. They're walking around on eggshells. They have to deal with my breakdowns, you know, my anger, just things that they don't understand because I'm not telling them about. I'm not talking about it. I didn't tell, you know, I didn't tell her that the reason why I punched the refrigerator and was so angry is because my friend had just been shot in the back of the head, and I felt like I had betrayed him. I felt like I had abandoned him to die. You know, I mean, maybe if I had, she might understand a little bit more, but you don't tell them that. And you're reluctant to get help and everything else. And so, and then the add on top of that, you stop having sex with them. Right. I mean, because that's just something that happens. I can't explain it. I guess I could get into a longer explanation and kind of go into the details of why I think that was, but you just don't. And so it's a very hard thing. And they're very alone because they feel like, who can they talk to about it? They can't betray
they don't even
my
understand
confidence.
themselves.
And so the fact, this type of thing, the destruction of the relationships, the destruction of families is something it's understood, but it's just not nearly spoken about as much as it needs to be.
And I'll tell you, you were mentioning there, you even had some Vietnam and World War II vets come up. We are talking about the Iraq, Afghanistan generation, and unfortunately, it's not stopping there. This is from the New York Times here a week or so ago, called, the headline is "A Secret War, Strange New Wounds, and Silence from the Pentagon." And I just want to read one real quick exception because I think this really, it got me. And I've experienced some of these things, and you know, I've seen other vets like you have suffered, but this one actually seemed a little bit different. And I wonder your view on this because you're a former Marine. So here's how that article opens up. When Javier Ortiz came home from a secret mission in Syria, the ghost of a dead girl appeared to him in his kitchen. She was pale and covered in chalky dust, as if hit by an explosion, and her eyes stared at him with a glare as dark and heavy as oil. The 21-year-old Marine was part of an artillery gun crew that fought against the Islamic State, and he knew that his unit's huge cannons had killed hundreds of enemy fighters. The ghost, he was sure, was their revenge. A shiver went through him, and he backed into another room of his apartment near Camp Pendleton in California and flicked on the light. Certainly that he was imagining things, but she was still there in his mind. A few days later, in the barracks not far away, a 22-year-old Marine named Austin Powell pounded on his neighbor's door in tears and stammered, "There's something in my room. I'm hearing something in my room." And the story just continues to go on. These are current people today that's happening just because they were firing cannons in Syria against Islamic State. This is not even talking about direct fire with some of these other things that you've experienced. But does any of that surprise you?
You know, the more I learn about it, the less I am surprised. A number of years ago, I would have been shocked that this is what the diagnosis is, that these guys got traumatic brain injury from just firing cannons. And I'd say there has to be some other explanation. I mean, lots of guys fire 155 rounds. Why do these guys get hit like this? And, you know, I think there's probably some other contributing factors as well in terms of a degree of moral injury, maybe, because they were just firing rounds into Raqqa. And as much as the article says how they just killed hundreds of Islamic State fighters, they killed a lot of civilians. They killed thousands of civilians. And so that may be weighing on them as well as in the PTSD. It says they're not in direct combat, but we know that's not how PTSD work. Just the fact that you are just around artillery fire like that around the clock, you are going to be in survival mode. Your system's going to be kicked on. And so I think some of it is the reporter's general understanding of what they're talking about here and relying upon just some basic tropes that, are kind of true, but not really so true, when we know. But with this idea that what these young men are dealing with, these Marines and soldiers came home with after firing thousands of artillery rounds, was the fact that the blast waves coming off those guns. If anyone's ever been around a 155, it ain't like the movies. I mean,
I used to be a platoon leader of a 155 howitzer platoon, so I had quite a bit of that myself.
Yeah, it's not like the movies, any of this stuff. I remember the first time I was on the hand grenade range, and how it ain't like the movies, you know. I mean, like, you know, I mean, so the idea that the blast waves from those guns, those thousands of blast waves cutting through these young men's brains. And I would speculate to say, I think one of the things that might be different now compared to, say, in the past, you look back photos from Vietnam, World War II, when they were firing guns like this, a lot of times they didn't have their helmets on. And there is a body of evidence out there that says some of our TBI may be caused by our helmets to put it very simply, capturing, keeping the blast wave in.
Focusing it on the brain instead of directing it, flecking it away.
That's exactly right. So, and that's just pure my speculation, just based upon what I've read and kind of hearing this, and because that's going to be the argument. It's like, well, how come it didn't happen when they were there in Vietnam? How come it didn't happen when they were in World War II?
Because a lot of it did. It just wasn't diagnosed. I mean,
that's
a big part of it.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's the same thing with the argument about the suicides. That what we're seeing now is, well, the VA didn't capture national suicide data until 2012. So anyone who says we're going to compare what's happening now and in the past is just full of it, because they never collected the information.
The data.
But we know anecdotally, as well as what we know from things like hospitalizations. I mean, during World War II, the U.S. Army was hospitalizing 350,000 soldiers a year for psychiatric disorders. 350,000. Right? PTSD isn't even a recognized diagnosis until 1980. I mean, so like the scale of this was massive in the good war.
Now that brings me back to where we actually started this conversation, and where I want to end it here. And that is with the war in Ukraine. So that's going to be something, maybe not exactly on the scale of what we had, but I guess for a nation, it probably will be on something close to a par for that. This ticking time bomb that's going on in the preparation for Ukraine right now, as they continue on now, heading into their 22nd month of war, and we're getting close to that 2-year anniversary. So the Senate just passed last night a continuing resolution bill for them, and apparently the president will sign it pretty soon to at least get us into the next time we're going to wonder if the government's going to be shut down in January. But it, importantly enough, did not include any money for either Israel or Ukraine. Now, lots of people are really interested in getting that money for Ukraine because they want to get more bombs and bullets and machine guns and tanks and aircraft, whatever else. They want to send a lot of that stuff. But there's no context at all about the people who will be using these things. And so I want your view, based on what you know about history, what your personal experience is. What should we be focusing on for Ukraine, aside from the tactics and the battalions and whatever else towards this war? What is building up here, and what is going to happen after this war is over, however it ends?
Right, it is. I mean, you just look at along a number of different lines. Say we had a magic wand, Danny, and we're able to end that horrible war right now, right? Just magically end it. The consequences of this, the legacy of it, is going to endure for generations. So you have, of course, the environmental consequences, right? The catastrophe that's happened to the land, the water, the air. You have the consequences of a destroyed infrastructure, destroyed industry. You've had a depopulated country. I mean, I just read a thing a few weeks ago where Ukraine's Minister of Economy saying how they need almost 5 million of the refugees to come back because they have such extreme labor shortages. And who's going back? Why would you go back? That type of thing. But then you have what you're alluding to is the long-term effects this is going to have on their veteran population, and then their families, their friends, their neighbors, in terms of care, and then the
And that's a point, because I mean, our VA is commonly trashed because they don't do a good enough job. Things take a lot of time. They're slow. But look, there's billions of dollars that we've invested in this kind of stuff, and there at least is care. But in Ukraine, I mean, I don't think they have the physical facilities, the trained staff, and definitely not the money. Where are they going to be able to take care of these people?
And if we look and see how their post-war reconstruction is lining up, it's going to be financed by JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, BlackRock. You have these Wall Street is going to go in there and own Ukraine. That's the way it's lining up. That's the way they've had meetings. They've had conferences about this. This is not hyperbole or speculation. This is widely reported by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And so do we think that, these vultures from Wall Street are doing this for any altruistic reasons? And do you think that they're going to want to see any of the money they put into Ukraine being utilized for things that don't provide returns? So where's the return for Jamie Dimon, right? For all these men and women who populate these big firms in terms of helping veterans heal? And so we are very far behind the US where we need to be. We're much better than we were 20 years ago. We're much better than we were 10 years ago in terms of our veterans care. Much better. And the VA has done a great job, and it needs to do more. It needs to be further resourced, but it's still the second largest federal department after the Department of Defense, $300 billion a year. And we're still looking around and saying it's not enough. And so if anyone thinks it's going to be enough for the Ukrainians with all they've been through, with 1 million men basically going to the front, enduring, as you said, the harshest combat, the most, I want to say harshest combat because that's a very subjective thing. And there are plenty of people around the world who could say, hey, Matt, come and experience this and let me know how you feel, how harsh it is. But in sense of the industrialized scale of it,
there.
right? But the industrialized scale of it, right? The industrialized slaughter that's occurring.
Right.
What that means in terms of post-war care, post-war healing, recovery, and you don't even know. Look, I mean, I've seen it repeatedly now. Most recently was the Time magazine article on Zelensky that came out last month. In there too, it talks about the average age of men in the Ukrainian armed forces is 43 years old. We've seen that repeatedly. This notion that the average age for the Ukrainian army is over 40. And so that means that their young men have been slaughtered. They've lost a generation, and many of them have been killed. But typically you have casualty rates of 3 to 4 times higher than what your death rate is. So for all those tens and tens of thousands of dead Ukrainian soldiers, maybe more, I don't know, more than 100,000, 200, no one knows. I don't even know if the Ukrainians know. But you then have to understand, right? Say it's 100,000 just to keep it easy, which I think is very possible. Well, then you're talking about most likely wounded rates of 300,000, 400,000.
That's maybe just the physical wounds. I mean, just your TBI and some other stuff. I mean, it's almost hard to imagine any of them not having some kind of trouble with TBI or PTSD. So
right, you'll see then that you'll see a whole generation and beset with those substance use disorders, with depression, with the suicide rate. Right. There's no reason to believe it won't be
a ticking time bomb.
It is.
All that stuff's going to happen when all the Western cameras move on, and we move on. We say, okay, problem solved. This war is over by whatever means. Then all of that damage is going to start manifesting. And I bet you don't have a lot of concern in Congress to let's pass a big bill and send a bunch of billions to help the aftercare. I bet there won't be a lot of that.
Right. And if for those of us who've been there and we lost friends and fellow Marines, soldiers, sailors, airmen, what happens to the families? Mothers and fathers are never the same again. Young women widows, girlfriends who lose their futures, basically. They're never the same. And then what that gets passed down. My radio operator killed himself after we came home. And so it'd be 16 years. And he had a baby girl on the way she'll be 16 next year. She never knew her father, never met her father. What does that do for her life? Right? What does that, I mean, so just again, that ripple effect, how this goes throughout the whole society. And I mean, and the scale of loss in Ukraine is so great that everyone is feeling it. It's not where it was like here in the US, where very, very easily, particularly certain parts of the country and certain demographics, they've never known anyone who went to Iraq and Afghanistan, let alone someone who was killed or wounded. But in Ukraine, the scale is so massive, it affects everyone. So what does this do mentally, emotionally, and then spiritually to a country? What comes out of this? And very often what can happen is very dark things.
Why I think it's so important that the United States at a government level stop just saying, yeah, we're just going to continue to throw as many bombs and bullets and dollars as you guys want, and start putting some effort towards trying to find a negotiated solution to end this madness, because it can't be won militarily. We've talked about that a bunch of times. So if that be the case, then it's a moral imperative, in my view, that we start doing something that could end this carnage instead of just blithely funding it and letting them go as far as they want to, because of the damage it's going to continue to cause. I think we need to have a big pause. And I know we can keep going on here forever, but this is not going away anytime soon. And I definitely want to have you back to talk about those things. And what are some possibilities? What could we do differently than we are now? To not, quote, abandon Ukraine or whatever, that are accused of. But I want to talk about it on our next episode. And I really appreciate you. I, of course, even more value your service to our country and your service to humanity, and always being an advocate for these kinds of things, always looking to bring peace everywhere, whether it's to the Palestinians, whether it's to the Iraqis, or now in Ukraine, or even in the Russian forces who are also fighting, because they're just doing what they're ordered to as well. And I just admire your humanity, and thank you for your service to mankind, and look forward to having you back on our subsequent show.
Thanks, Danny. I appreciate that. You know, I feel the same. So thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot. And we'll leave it there for now. And we will definitely look forward to seeing you on the next episode, where we will remain unintimidated and unprovoked, or we're not going to be provoked to shut up about any of these things. We're going to keep bringing you the truth. Thanks. And that's it for the Deep Dive today.